Yeah, well, so I just wanted to, we'll start now. We're live in every way. I wanted to welcome Jane Shapiro to this group. It's a pleasure to have you. I also wanted to thank again Elisa, Andy, and now Michael Goldenberg for sponsoring this class. If you would like to sponsor this class, you can email office@bethshalom-ri.org or make a donation at Beth Shalom with two O's, OLOM-RI.org, and make a contribution in honor of this class. But of course, this class is free for you, for anyone, and apparently for the entire world to benefit from. So that's good, and that's the point. It's not about the money, it's about the content. But our synagogue certainly can use the money to continue to function. So that is the end of my fundraising, and now on to mysticism, which we've been bantering about. What is mysticism? What isn't mysticism? I'm not going to say more about that at the moment. Is it the wrong share? Well, yeah, no, that was the right share. Okay. So last time we were at the end of a teaching, and today what we're going to do is finish that teaching and pick up with the teaching of Rav Hamnuna Sava. The teaching of Rav Hamnuna Sava is recorded in many different places, in different versions, not just the Zohar. So this is, sometimes there are these independent teachings that make their way into the Zohar, which are recounted elsewhere in the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, in this case in the Aleph Beta de Rabbi Akiva, and other midrashic traditions. So that happens often, but the Zohar will have its own spin. But before we do that, we're going to just finish the last teaching. Interestingly, the last teaching is tangentially related to plagues, which I don't know if that's good or bad, but it is what it is. So, and the format is we'll read the Aramaic, and then, because it's beautiful, and I think part of the beauty of the Zohar, but then we'll jump to the English, which is, I think, the language people are good conversing with this in. So we were working with this verse from Yeshayahu, and the end of the verse says, Ish lo nedar. And it says, Ish lo nedar me'inun shitin ribo da afik bechela dishma, ubegin de ish lo nedar b'chol atar demitu Yisrael vet anshu bechovaihu itmenun velo a'adar me'inun. Shitin ribo afilu chad. Begin lemeheve kola diunka chada. Kamad de ish lo nedar le'ela, uvhachi lo nedar letata. And so, in case it wasn't obvious what that meant to you, I'll tell you. So what is, what are we talking about? And vast power. So it says here, mystery of the upper world, which attains the name Elohim, as we have said, not one is missing. Not one of those 600,000 generated by the power of the name. So what did we say? Last time we said that the 6 sfirot of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. By the way, yesterday was the reputed yahrzeit, or Hilula, anniversary of the death of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the supposed author of the Zohar, compiler of the Zohar, whatnot. Obviously, the academics have plenty to say about that not being really true, but nonetheless, it's good to be studying this the day after everyone was doing Zohar. Like yesterday, Jews all over the universe briefly tapped into the Zohar for a day, and here we are the day after. It almost feels like the day after Simchat Torah to me. Like everyone's dancing with the Torah on Simchat Torah, but who's dancing with the Torah the day after Simchat Torah? Those are the truly committed. And so there's something nice about that. These 6, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, are 6, represented by the numerology of the letter Vav, which is the 6th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is the 3rd letter of God's name. So 6, it's 6, it's these 6. And these 6, if you multiply them by 1,000, give you 100,000, give you 600,000. And why would we multiply these 6 by 100,000? The answer is because these things, they look limited in the circled bubbles on the chart, but there's an unlimited quality to them, right? These are things that are, even if we can understand them, we can understand God's kindness as a concept, or God's gevurah, or strength. And of course, all of these, since they're an emanation, represent not just God as some abstract entity, but an immanent entity, and so therefore inherent in our psyche as well. There's an image of God that's inherent in all things and all people that is crucial to spiritualizing, as a verb, this system. When you multiply chesed by 100,000, what you're saying is, I understand what it is to be kind. Today, someone called and said they needed help with something. Can you do it? And I said, yes. And so I'm being kind. I understand that. But God's kindness, even though it's understandable to us as an entity, is beyond the kindness we could fathom. So I don't know if quantity versus quality is quite the right description. I don't think it is. There's some way in which God's kindness is relatable, but infinite still in comparison to ours. And so multiplying by 100,000 has that feature. Now, we said repeatedly in 3 different teachings that kegavna de la'ela, just like it is above, so too it is below. And there's this notion that Israel represents this. In particular, the 600,000 male Israelites, 603,550, but let's just knock that down to 600,000 for a simple rounding, counted in the census in the desert, in the Torah, the 600,000 represent this. And so there's an equation the Zohar is making between God and Israel. Israel is the corporeal body that manifests God's everything below, in Malchut, in Shekhinah, in this world, or partners with God in the balanced creation of the universe, or perfection of the universe. There is that sense. So once we do that, and we've been talking about the emanation of these 6 sfirot from Binah above. So to emanate them also means, in a sense, to emanate the Jewish people. That's what the Zohar is saying. And it's equating the creation of the Jewish people with the emanation of these sfirot from Binah. And so not one is missing, not one of the 600,000 generated by the power of the name, because not one is missing. Whenever any one of the children of Israel died as punishment for their sins, the people were counted, and not even one of the 600,000 was lacking. So there's this idea, why do they ever take a census? They take a census to check, to make sure after people die for a sin that we're still there. And of course, there's this thing that works, which is like whenever something is destroyed, something else is created. But we're always going to be at this 600,000. I'll note on this, the teaching from the Baal HaSulam. That was the Hebrew we were working with before. I don't know if people know the Sulam, Rabbi Ashlag. He was a Kabbalist in Poland, I think in Lodz. Could be wrong about that. Check Wikipedia. In fact, check me if you feel otherwise. Yehuda Leib Ashlag, who wrote a commentary on the Zohar called the Sulam. And he moved to Israel. He studied with prominent Kabbalists. He was a Hasidic Rebbe who was different in the sense that he believed, not unlike Aryeh Kaplan later or others now, that mysticism should be broadly shared in this time, that it should no longer be kept confined, secret, even though he was of an insular sort of training. He believed in the broad teaching of Kabbalah, and so he published 2 things. One is something called the Talmud Eser Sfirot, which is a textbook for advanced Kabbalah studies for the people that know something. And then he published a commentary on the Zohar. In his commentary, all of that as an introduction to say, this teaching is very important to him. He refers to it a fair amount. And the context which he quotes it in is that, and I would say his commentary is perhaps the most studied commentary on the Zohar, so it becomes a very important teaching, that these 600,000, the Sfirot all derive from one. This notion of God's emanating different qualities all comes from one ratzon, one will or desire of goodness at the beginning. And even Kabbalists want to maintain the title monotheists, that there aren't 10 gods, but there's one God. We're just describing an emanation process. So if that's what we're doing, it's not 10 gods, it's one God just emanating in a particular way that we can describe to some extent with words, then these 600,000 represent one primordial soul, sometimes referred to as Adam Kadmon, the primordial Adam, as it were, or a sense that even the different personalities of people, in this case Jewish people, but it really represents all people, and in a modern context we might just say humans if you wanted. There's a shared commonality to it. It has a diversity of 600,000 represented by the Sefirot, but it has a unity of stemming from one fundamental thing, and ultimately kol echad, as the Zohar keeps saying every chapter, it's all one. They want to pull you away from too much diversification as the end. The end is to unify. So he quotes it there also to say that there's this idea, and I think Chabad has run with this idea, so people know it, that there's a certain amount of primordial souls that exist, and that's it. There are 600,000 souls, and you have some version of that soul, and so souls split. Anyone ever heard this idea? That sometimes souls, I can't see everyone on my screen, so pipe in if you have, that if you ever feel like you really share something deep with someone, maybe you have part of the same shared soul, and maybe you.
Quick question, Rabbi. For 2 questions. Souls are not usually conceived of as being splittable or partitionable, like them shared in that way. But then would this also, second question, naturally just go with reincarnation? If there's always 600,000, when one goes, that same soul is just reproduced in a new body? Is that where this is going?
That it does go there, sure. So there's definitely reincarnation inherent in this teaching, or at least the way the Ari worked with this teaching. See Shar HaGilgulim, the Gate of Reincarnation, in the writings of Rav Chaim Vital, for the full systematic exposition of it. But yeah, the basic idea is that souls are on this soul journey from Sinai or even creation till a messianic future. And there are lots of stops on the journey, and they can split into different bodies at different times or in the same time. And so almost not unlike, since we were working with Confer's equation last time, and as we recall, Confer's equation was something like Dina emanates into all of the Sefirot is E equals MC squared. I think that was Confer's equation. Is that right, Rabbi Confer?
I don't know if we can call it Confer's equation. I was just making the parallel between, the unity of all things in the scientific world and in Zohar's mind.
Great. So I'm going to apply that to say then that since space-time are just facets of perception, but are essentially one thing, not space or time, but space-time in this context, souls are therefore splittable. Even before Einstein, I guess Kabbalah worked with this sense that souls can be split in different people at different times, or at different times across time, and even perhaps that the souls can be combined, that it's not just one pure soul in a person, but that there may be souls may be cohabiting, multiple souls may be cohabiting one body, and so there's sort of complication to it, as you might imagine.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
So this is making me think about modern philosophy and this focus on, the individual and the value of each person, and how this really flies in the face of that, and how perhaps there's a greater emphasis being placed on the importance of all, both as one and as I'm not verbalizing this well, but as representations of one, and the one being God, as opposed to I think therefore I am. I am the primary thing to think about and to worry about and to consider. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So I will say that I think in general, Descartes is something of an opposition to mystical thinking, because much mystical thinking places thought in a context. Descartes' I think, therefore I am, places the act of thinking in a sociolinguistic context of hierarchy, but thought is not the apex of that hierarchy. There's something often much deeper than that hierarchy. It's often beyond words. See Rav Shagar's writing for that. And so, yes, for that reason. And then also, right, I remember when I was in elementary school, the emphasis of teaching, which I think is different than the way it's largely considered now, the progressive emphasis on thinking at that time was that we all share a lot more than we differ. And so there were messages of unity across diversity regularly proposed by my elementary school teachers. Like I recall my second grade teacher when someone moved from Africa and joined the class saying, even though this person has a different religion, in that case, I think it was Yoruba, but I don't remember, right? And like very different foods and customs and skin color being the very obvious one, and primarily Jewish and Ashkenazic Jewish and Italian Catholic Long Island. There weren't really any other Black people that I can recall, right? It wasn't a thing. So the saying, but we were all human beings and we share much more than we don't. And I think now the emphasis is on the diversity and perhaps even the victimization of diversity, which is this particular spin on diversity, not just diversity, but the negative aspect of diversity, which is incomparable to anyone else's negative aspect. Like no one but the Jew knows the anti-Semitism of the Jew. No one, and so there's, yeah, so I think that the mystical trend is more like the old thinking, which is to say that the focus ought to be on the unity and not on the difference. And to an extent that can be maybe not validating to individuals fully, probably. There's a sense in which it pulls against individualistic instincts that might be helpful to a lot of us on the one hand. And on the other hand, and then I'll end my sort of commentary comment here, which is way outside the text, which is like my opinion, is that where was I going? But basically what I want to say is this. I think that we live in a super individualistic society where people are like bothered to have obligations to anyone else, let alone to see themselves as part of each other. And I'll quote here the teaching of my wife's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Shmelka of Nicholsburg, the teacher of Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who said that, there was a rabbi who came to him, a Hasidic rabbi, and said, how am I supposed to love my neighbor as myself? It says to love your neighbor as yourself, but my neighbor is really rude to me. My neighbor hates me. He thinks I'm a heretic, or whatever the case may be. And so how do I love people like that? So he said two things. First of all, you should have pity on that person, that every person has a spark of God above in them, but God's spark is stuck living with this person. You should feel so bad that like, oh, God's spark is that? Like God has to forget you. God made a spark and look at the spark. He's acting so rudely. So that is one thing he said, which sounds like it's from an old Yiddish story. But I don't know if pity is a good posture to have to people or not. But the other thing he said is that you should view it like you're parts of one body. So just because he smacked you, so to speak, he uses the, like the image of hitting another person, doesn't mean that you should then respond in kind by hitting him, because you're all part of one body. And that would be like taking a knife and stabbing yourself because someone did something mean to you. It would be an act of self-harm. And so you should view harming another human being, not constructive rebuke, but harming another human being like an act of self-harm, no differently. So I think that thinking is, I give that story to illustrate how a Hasidic Rebbe would take this sort of thinking, right, which is to sort of popularize it and say, well, one way to take this kind of teaching is, if you react harshly to someone who's mean to you, you're stabbing yourself. There's a very tangible, ethical, what to do teaching from it. Okay, did that answer was that responsive to what you were saying?
Very much, thank you.
If I'm ever non-responsive to what people are getting at, say so. So now, because not one is missing, there's this interesting thing, which is that whenever one dies, like another one appears, right? There's always there's a homeostasis. And that's how it works. So that's basically the end of this teaching about the emanation of Binah. And it just taken the teaching about Bina emanating the Sphira, which we discussed, and then giving a metaphor of saying, and this is what happens with the souls of Israel. It's the same emanative process. Anyone wants to comment on the end of that teaching before we move on to the teaching of the letters of Rav Hamnuna Sava? Great. Okay, so then we will move to the next teaching. I have to find, here we are.
Is it too late to weigh in with one thought at the very end of that teaching? I know we all want to move forward.
It's never too late. My goodness, no.
I just, I went and just took another look at Isaiah 40:26. It's such a beautiful verse, which is being obviously commented on throughout what we're reading here. And just to quickly read it, lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. It's just a beautiful poem on its own. But I just wanted to appreciate how the Zohar is putting together like the metaphysics of creation. That's a lot of what's been going on over these last several teachings and lessons. Big stuff about, the one emanating the many and the spherod, etc. But part of the whole point of it was that process isn't complete until sort of the human being sits back and recognizes it and admires it. And that's exactly what Isaiah is doing. That's just, look up the heavens, ask these questions. It strikes the individual with awe. So the metaphysics of creation isn't complete until the human being is aware and recognizes it. And it's just beautiful how the Zohar does this by looking at, doing this commentary on this particular bit of the prophets. So just
thank you. That's always a good methodology, actually, in the teaching, which Andy points out, which makes good Zohar study go from good to excellent, which is to understand the Zohar's, the pshat, the plain meaning of the verse, the Zohar's reread of the verse, how often it is both subversive yet oddly supportive of the verse. Like in this case, it's about, see who created these things. It's about dogma, and we switch see who to like taking the question who very literally and moving it from the stars to metaphysical entities which emanate the stars. But methodologically, thank you for ending there. That's always important to do. I'll also note that your comment does jive with something that Elisa was just saying that we were just speaking about, which is this interesting idea of like individualism and unity, because still the person in the verse in Isaiah who's admiring the stars is an individual. It's not a collective. And it harkens back a little bit to our teaching of Petach Einayim, the teaching that you may recall that notion of Petach Einayim, the place with Yehuda and Tamar being the opening of all of this, the opening of the eyes. And there's a sense in which it is the individual consciousness, which is the gateway into this whole thing. And it's the individual consciousness seeking union. So there's this interesting play about individuals seeking to unify, still from the perspective of individuals, right? And anyone is only operating from their own perspective still. And so the starting point for us is kind of, to the mystical journey, is from a perspective of ego and individuality, which is interesting to think about. Like that's always a starting point. Bereshis, Rav Hamnuna Sava Amar, Ashkachan Asvan Behifucha. We'll go to it, but you find it's backward. You find the letters are backwards. Bet bekadmisa ulevasar, bet bekamisa hainu breshis, bra levasar, aleph bekadmisa ulevasar, aleph bekadmisa hainu Elohim, and et levatar. So the Torah starts with 4 words. Now, we're still on creation. Now we're not looking at creation from the cosmic perspective of creating the stars. We're looking at creation the way the Torah describes it. Bereshit. And something important to say here always, I think, in describing this is Rashi's take on Bereshit, which is not the way the King James Bible translated it, and probably is better grammatically with the Hebrew. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Rashi describes, doesn't mean batchila, in the beginning God created. Rashi talks about that, but it is Bereshit. It is a smichut, a prepositional phrase in English. In the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth, comma. Not in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, which is a finite act, but in the beginning of God's creation of the heaven and the earth, comma, Breshit bara Elohim. It's a Breshit with the tuf at the end. Rashi feels as smichut is joining with the other things to modify it. So the first things described aren't necessarily the act of creation themselves, but within the time period called the beginning of God's creation, which is a very different thing because it allows, and let me tell you why, it allows for all kinds of things to happen before that, right? In the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth, some of these things happen. It's very different than in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. It also means that who knows what came before the heavens and the earth. All sorts of things possibly came before, right? In the beginning, God, as opposed to in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and that's the beginning. This is in the beginning of a thing. And what about before that beginning of a thing? Who knows? Who cares? I mean, anything. So lots of people care, but I'm saying you understand, I think. So I think that take of openness that the Zohar will have with the beginning, and the Talmud in its way, saying that before the creation of this world, God created and destroyed many other worlds, which is something the Talmud says in a few places, is based on a tradition that Rashi is noting in the Chumash and the Torah of a better grammatical read of the Hebrew, which was mistranslated by the King James. So I just wanted to note that up front. The letters are backwards. You would have expected maybe, that God would have started the Bible by starting with the first letter, Aleph, for a sort of poetic symmetry, and then moving to Bet, especially because you get the first two letters being at the beginning. You get Bet and Aleph, the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet, being the first among the first letters of the Bible. But you get Bet, Aleph, Aleph, as the first letter of the first four words. The letter of the first word, Breshit, is Bet, and the first letter of the second word, Bara, is Bet. The first letter of the third word is Aleph, and the first letter of the fourth word is Aleph. So it's not the Aleph Bet, it's the Bet Aleph. Why did God make them backwards? That's Rav Hamnuna Sava's first observation question. Alakadba kuchabrichu lemebed alma. Call Asvan Habu Stimin, Utreofen Shnina de Lobrahma, have a Mistako Kuchabrichu Bishtashabahu. So, the reason is when Kuchabrichu, now, important to note, do you see the Sefirot now? Just so I know, what do you see?
No, just the text.
Just the text. Interesting. Okay. Well, Kuchabrichu, I think it's worth me fixing that. Hold on. It's a pause, but it'll be worth it for me. Do you see like my files now, or you still just see?
Yeah.
We see files.
Yeah, okay, great. Oh, da. Okay, I don't know why that's happening. The point is the following. The Sefirot, if you have them, if you can picture them, if you can conjure them, if you can Google them, I don't know why it's not letting me. I'll help you out here. Now you see the Sefirot, that I know. The Sefirot, Kuchabrichu, is a way of referring to Tiferet, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. Whenever it says Hakadosh Baruch Hu, or in the Aramaic Kuchabrichu, it's referring to this complex, the Tiferet emanative complex. It's not the military-industrial complex, but it's the the lower six Sefirot. This is Kuchabrichu. And whenever in the Siddur, it says that you might say, in parentheses, the incantation, I'm doing this to unite Kuchabrichu, the holy blessed one, with Shchinteh, with his beloved divine presence, it's talking about a unification of these with Malchut, of essentially bringing the divine world below. This is in many Sidurim, before every mitzvah, like counting the Omer, before Psuke de Zimra. This is the Hasidim were obsessed with this. They put in the Siddur everywhere. So that's what it means. And part of what it means, of course, is that this whole entity of Kudshabrichu is a he. The he is important. So it's actually interesting because the modern progressive trend is to degender HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When I grew up, the translation would always, the Holy One, blessed is he. But then the way to translate it became, the proper way to translate it became the Blessed Holy One, so that it no longer has the he, it no longer has the gender. But actually in the Kabbalah, the gender is crucial to the appellation because HaKadosh Baruch Hu refers to Tiferet, and Tiferet in the Kabbalah is representative of a phallus, of a male, but the letter Vav in God's name, which is a long stick, is actually meant to be a phallic symbol. That is to say, the male sort of internal workings of God, or what they presume are masculine characteristics. Obviously, there's a lot to say about masculinity and femininity in modern science. But the Kabbalah definitely perceives of Tiferet as the male and Shechinteh as the male's wife. And perceives this act as an act of creative union that could be described sexually, is described sexually in the Kabbalah. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is very much Hu, and Shechinteh is very much, Shechina is very much, just as that's masculine, the Shechina, Malchut, the other part of God, is feminine. So I just wanted to say, whenever they say Kudshabrichu, that's what they're talking about. Comment or question on that before I... Okay, I just saying that to say that. So the following thing happens. When the Blessed Holy One, they actually did the translation here as well even, that's Tiferet in a sense, but wished to fashion the world, all the letters were hidden away. For 2,000 years before creating the world, more to say about this, the Blessed Holy One contemplated them and played with them. Now, this sentence, for 2,000 years before creating the world, the Blessed Holy One contemplated them and played with them, can be reread in the Kabbalistic tradition. And here I'll give you the reading of the Ari for the Zohar, because I feel like it's the best reading. The Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria, living in Tzfat, also passed away in a plague. Now every rabbi that passed away in a plague, it feels different. Like he passed away young in a plague in Tzfat. I forget what the plague was, but it just feels like a different thing. Sort of the progenitor of modern Kabbalah read it as follows. For 2,000 years before creating the world, the Blessed Holy One contemplated them and played with them is 2,000 years represent Chokhmah and Binah. You know, if we're multiplying Sfirot by 1,000 to sort of express their infinity, the 1,000 years can refer to Sfirot. And so before creating the world, that is before Binah emanated, you know, the structure of things, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so this is interesting, like that which was to come, namely the sort of embryonic reality of that. It didn't exist yet in its reality, but it existed in, maybe potential is the right word. In Kabbalah, they use the term ibor a lot. This is the term the Arvi uses to mean that something exists embryonically. So it doesn't fully exist, but it exists in some small way that can germinate, like a seed. So for 2,000 years, God played with this. In other words, Binah, played with it, contemplated it. The word contemplation here is an active Binah, is to say that Chokhmah and Binah come first, but Kudshabrichu is the one doing the contemplation. And so there's this sense in which these things exist within Binah and are being contemplated, but also because they exist within Binah, they're also contemplating. And so there's, this is part of this is describe how you emanate. And emanating is different than creating, right? Because things emerge from the next thing almost magically, but naturally. You know, they just flower up in the way that I'm struggling to find words, but someone can help me with some precision. And so we're describing here it's not that Binah creates these things. That would be like the old way of thinking. But the Kabbalistic emanation way of thinking is these things exist within and emanate themselves almost. There's a self, all of the Sfirot exist within the 50 gates of Binah, sort of 7 times 7 plus 1, as we said in a prior teaching. 49 represent all of these things multiplied by all of these things, plus some one for good measure, because we can never understand any of it. It's beyond, it's me, it's who. It's still a question. So the point is, for 2,000 years, they're around in Binah, and then they emanate.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
pointed out that Kabbalah and its roots believed in the creativity of letters. So isn't this going back to that the letters of the alphabet themselves are kind of this creative potentiality out of which also the universe is created?
Yeah. So good. Okay. So we're talking about letters. So it is important to note that in the Kabbalistic system, every one of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet can find a place in the pathways between the Sfirot, because letters are a form of communication, and they're used to help the primordial letters help the Sfirot communicate. In the Sefer Yetzirah, it's very clear that the Sfirot and the letters represent two different creative Kabbalistic systems which interplay with each other, right? The Sefer Yetzirah's main thesis is there are 10 Sfirot, B'li without any reality to them, but yet they determine the reality of the whole world. And there are these letters. And the whole rest of it is about describing two mystical systems which must relate to each other in some way. There's an awkward fit between them at times. But yeah, the letters and the Sfirot are sort of two different mystical traditions. And this is sort of a take at mixing them. That makes sense. We're kind of playing in two languages at once. Letter language and number language. So God contemplated them and played with them. Note the quality of play. Progressive educators should be excited to hear this. God played with the letters. God's creation is playful. Just that on its own is interesting. The creative potentials happen when we play, as opposed to crush it with thought. Playfulness. Okay. As he verged on creating the world, all the letters presented themselves before him from last to first. And now we set the stage for a fantastic audition to be the first letter of the Torah. Every letter comes to try and do this thing.
Rabbi, just
Yeah?
explaining letters.
What, Andy, you're muting in and out.
Sorry about that. This teaching begins with this paragraph about the letters being backwards, right? Beit, Beit, Aleph, Aleph. And we're beginning to get the reason for that. But the reason for the backwards sequence isn't given in this first paragraph. And I see we have many paragraphs ahead as they're going to go through all the letters. So I'm just curious, is it possible to summarize for us now, like briefly, why are the letters backwards? Or do we have to go through all? I even looked at the end of the sequence. It doesn't look like they ever answer that question, but that could be just because I've skimmed it too lightly. Why are those letters backwards? Beit, Beit, Aleph, Aleph.
It's a good question.
We wait and see could be a fine answer as well. So
let's see. I'll give you a tangential possibility that I'm thinking, which is that, but it could be wrong, like anything, is there's this sense of creation, and we're working with they're going to tell you why the bet is first. And so the technical answer could just be something like bet was first because Aleph couldn't be, based on the rejection of Aleph as a silent letter by the Zohar. And once Aleph couldn't be, bet was first, but Aleph still retained its place as like next because it's the first actual letter of the alphabet. So that could be the technical answer, is that once bet is first, then Aleph will be next. But, and the Ramban sometimes on the Chumash sometimes refers to this as the sod bet, the secret of the bet. So if you want to know what he means by the secret of the bet, which he can't tell you, you're about to learn the secret of the bet, which is exciting. I'll tell you, Andy, that it could also be because of Chokhmah and Binah, I think, that there's a sense in which the emanation is happening from above to below, but also from below to above. And below is a place of multiplicity. In this case, bet represents 2 and aleph represents 1. And so the perspective of Binah, the place that emanates multiplicity or diversity, or the structure of our world where it doesn't appear unified, is the starting place of creation. In other words, our starting point of Breshit, of examining and trying to relate to God, is from a world of 2, not a world of 1. And Binah sort of has a prominence to Chokhmah from the perspective of the seeker. It's the place that things emanate from. It's more important to us. Binah is more important to the Zohar than Chokhmah because they are humans. So that, I don't know if that begins to address this. I think this is at play. Okay. But I'm open to other suggestions from people. If you have them, pipe in at any time. Kad be'ala mivrei alma, also call asma kameni sofad reshayu. Okay, so first, Shurias tough the male beresha. Amra ribon min nicha kamach lemivri bialma. De ana chosma dikushbanka dilach emes. Va'at iskrias emes. Yos lamalka emes lemishre bos emes lemivri bi alma. Amar lakud shabrichu. Yos ant vizaka ant. Lesant kedai lemivri bach alma. However, ant zamina lemehevi rishim al mitzchin de guvrin mehemnin de kimin oraisa me alef yatav. Uvrishimo dilach yemusim. Ba'od de ant chosama de mabes. However, ant kach les anakadai lemivri bach alma miad nafkas. Okay. Oh, I don't have to stop the share to switch the share. I'll learn this and it'll be less annoying for you. So the tough comes. Where's the tough? The letter tough entered first of all. She said, Master of the worlds. I feel like we should have a play here and people should choose different letters and should play the letters. Mm-hmm. I always imagine this as a play, the play of the letters for elementary students and for advanced students. Master of the worlds, may it please you to create the world by me. For I complete your seal, the word emet, truth. Again, important to note, emet contains the first, last, and middle letter of the alphabet. Aleph is the first letter, Taf is the last letter, and Mem is the middle letter. So truth represents here empirically, just in the structure of the word, all things in perspective, not having sided too far. It's comparable to the notion of balance that's at play in the Sfirot, just in the letters. So I just want to draw the parallel for you between Emet and Tiferet. And by the way, Emet in the Kabbalistic system is considered an appellation of the Sfira Tiferet, balance or beauty. Okay, so Emet comes and says, I'm the tough, I'm the last letter of the word truth, and you are called truth. You know, in the Hebrew text we just read, it said more than this, didn't it? It said in the Aramaic that we read that I complete your seal. Okay, yeah, I complete. So there's this teaching, Chotmo shel Kadosh Baruch Hu Emet, the seal of God is truth. That's, kings had like a seal that they would sign things with, and God's is truth. And you're called truth. Therefore, it's fitting for the King of Truth to begin with the letter of truth and to create the world by me. The Blessed Holy One replied, you are seemingly unworthy, but not deserving to initiate creation, since you are destined to be marked on the foreheads of the faithful who fulfilled the Torah from Aleph to Tav, and by your mark, they will die. This refers to an obscure Talmud based on messianic visions of the war of Gog and Magog, where there are two Hebrew letter systems. There's Ktav Ivri, the old Hebrew letter system, which was the Israelite text, comparable to the Phoenician text, which was used. And then around to the time of Ezra, the text was switched to the Hebrew letter system we know now. So the old letter system, the letter Tuf wasn't represented in this pictograph, but rather was represented by our modern X, the letter X. So X is a natural mark, like you put X's in boxes of IRS forms. In the biblical version of it, the righteous would be marked with the letter X so that they would be spared during the apocalypse. Like these people will be saved, don't kill them, they get an X on their foreheads. And so there's this Talmudic take on it that says that they die too. Even the X people will get killed. And why will the righteous who deserve to live be killed? This idea that, well, they didn't save the other people. So this is what the Zohar alludes to. You are seemingly unworthy, meaning you're going to get saved, Tuf, on the letter of these people. And why was Tuf chosen? Tuf is chosen by the prophet because it's an X. An X is just a normal mark. I wonder if that's true cross-culturally. Like in Chinese, is there a symbol that looks like X that's also a mark? I don't know if this is it seems to be at least the cross-cultural of modern America and ancient Israel. So check that.
But you mentioned, so at the time of Ezra, there was a change in Hebrew lexicography. Would that be the right word? Or the way Hebrew was written, the letters? Mm-hmm. For many or all of the letters at that time?
For all of the letters, basically.
So then when we're talking about, Zohar's account of creation using letters, do these resemble the old letters or the new letters? Or this is like the Platonic form of letters, independent of how they might have been written down by
This is a problem with the Kabbalistic system, so much so that there are commentaries. So the Gemara in Megillah is the place where this is described. They talk about letters. There's a tradition about certain letters in the tablets of the Decalogue of the Ten Commandments being letters that floated. In other words, if the letters are not just written into the tablet, but carved all the way through. So in some letters, the Talmud explains, you have this miracle, B'nes Hayu Umdin, of flying intermediate things. Like if you imagine the letter Samach, which is essentially a circle, and if you imagine that the tablet wasn't just written on, but entirely carved through. So some letters you can carve through and it's like a paper cut. But other letters you carve through and you have a floating piece of stone that's attached to no other part of the stone of the Ten Commandments. So how could that be? So the Talmud says it was a miracle. So they get into a discussion there, but some of the letters that it says are miraculous aren't miracles in the letters that we have. So no, it was the old letters. So the Talmud derives the archaeology from this problem of the tradition of its miraculous letter tradition, and derives what's true. Now, there, some of the more Kabbalistically inclined medieval commentators say, actually, there were three things. First, we had these original letters, and then came these distorted Phoenician-looking letters in the intermediate period, came Ezra and his court and restored the initial letters. And so that's an answer that traditional Kabbalists were inclined to for a long time. The only problem with it is that with modern archaeology, we know that the plain account of the Talmud, that there were letters and then they switched, is actually true. The Kabbalistic answer to this about the primordial nature of the letters does result in an artifice of attributing things to the shape of the current letters, which are newer letters.
Can I just add, because I'm doing a project on this right now too. They're actually, it's an Assyrian alphabet is what modern, and it's used by Nabateans and these Arabic cultures called the Dadanites and the Leonites. So it's kind of almost like the Latin kind of language or Latin alphabet of the 1200 BC.
Wait, so just to clarify, what is the lingua franca or the Latin of 1200 BC?
The Assyriac language. So it's it goes across kind of the sort of Middle East from sort of Mesopotamia down into the Arabic Peninsula and then into sort of the fringes of what was the Egyptian Empire. That was kind of and My understanding is it is derived from a Phoenician kind of language too, but it's basically Assyrian.
That's really interesting. I will say, so we had the experience about 2 years ago of going to Sweden on vacation, and we went to the more slightly north in Sweden to see these runes, which are these somewhat old but not quite ancient inscriptions, from, I don't remember exactly what year, from old Swedish kings. And I was shocked to see that they looked precisely like the old Hebrew alphabet. I was like, what's going on here? And then I did a little more looking, and it seems that this alphabet may have made its way through Carthage and Europe in different ways, and sort of had a spread to it.
Yeah, and the runes were like, they were weird. They were like tossed almost too. I said they were used as an alphabet, but they were also used as like soothsaying kind of device to like throw runes and then you pick on them.
Yeah.
But if you go, I was at Nabatean ruins in middle Saudi Arabia, and it was wild. The alphabet that the Nabateans used, which was a little bit before the Romans, was exactly the same as basically very close to the Hebrew alphabet. So, and they spoke kind of a version of Aramaic. So anyway, sorry, I don't want to digress off that, but the actual archaeology is kind of all coming from the Assyrians, that alphabet.
Cool. I'm going to say, if you have more questions about the alphabet, I'm happy to put you in contact with Joe, who clearly is the expert of this room on this subject. So I don't think many of us have been to Saudi Arabia to examine the glyphs of the Nabatean alphabet and studied this anywhere near the depth that he has. So I'm just going to say, if you have more questions about what is a really interesting subject, and Joe, we may have you give a guest lecture on the development of alphabets at some point. This is, if you're willing.
I'm not sure that I'll be totally qualified. I'm qualified enough to have a beer with someone who really knows what they're talking about. That's how qualified I am.
Got it. Well, all right. Maybe we can find that person and we'll go to a bar when bars do open. So, so I don't know if that answers your question, Andy. It's a sort of cop-out of saying it is a difficulty. So what happens to Tuf here? So God says, you're going to be on the foreheads of the faithful who fulfilled the Torah from Aleph to Tuf. This is the drush. Why do they get the Tuf? Not because it's an X and X is a good mark, but because it means they fulfilled every precept of the Torah, symbolized by the last letter. And by your mark, they will die. Yet they still get killed. Why do they get killed? Mind you, in the Talmudic account there, the reason they get killed, and I think that's crucial to the text, this text is assuming that Talmudic teaching, is because they didn't save the other people. They had the truth, but they still let the apocalypse happen. So obviously they couldn't have been that great because they didn't save their society. It's a version of the view of Noach that says that he wasn't that righteous because he saved himself, but not the others. It's one view. Obviously there's another view of Ish Tamim Haya B'Dorotav, that he was righteous in his generation. But this is similar to that idea. Furthermore, you are the seal of Mavet. You're also the last letter of the word death. You got truth, but you're also the angel of death here. So no, not you. And she immediately departed from God's presence. I just want to say something about this. Every time a letter comes, it's a claim that that's the quality of God that's the most important to start the Torah, or maybe the most important, or the most generative quality. And this is a much broader teaching about truth, which is to say that we might think that truth is the ultimate. And that claim actually gets rejected with the following logic. You can have the truth, your truth, and actually be totally righteous in that. But being right, there's a phrase, being right, something. The equivalent of doesn't matter, doesn't win you friends. In an argument, I'll just make it plain, you can be right, and that's not all that important. What?
Yeah, and still not win.
You can be right and still not win. It's not about
in the end.
So this is sort of like the innocence of truth coming forward and say, like, I'm the truth. And God's saying it's not about being true. Almost like a propagandist here, right? Like it's about like who wins. And truth doesn't win because truth is also death. There's this piece of truth which also has a self-righteousness to it. and that's part of the Talmudic teaching, that just because you're right, well, like anyone who's right is obviously only right from their perspective. And here we're getting to the sort of objective or subjective nature of truth, which is actually a really prominent modern discussion. And truth is seen, I think, here in some ways in the Zohar as a little bit subjective. I don't know that we should say objective versus subjective entirely. There's a sense in which if you are right, you might judge other people and kill them, mavet, or deem them worthy for death. Or say they're bad and I'm right and they're wrong. And actually that would lead you to not want, being right might lead you as a person to not want to save other people. Like I'm right, they're wrong. There is a radio show on Patriot Radio that actually the slogan of the show, I'm not going to name the show, but you heard the show, is I'm right, they're wrong, that's the end of the story. That's like the slogan of the show's name. So the Zohar responds to saying, A, that's doesn't matter. You're not going to convince many people with that radio show. It's like, I'm right, they're wrong. You may gain some listeners from your already converted, but like they, the ones who are wrong, are likely not going to be slapped into believing it. But also, I'm right, they're wrong. They're wrong is a natural outflow from I'm right, but the Zohar is more interested in unity. And you don't come to unity with people that think differently, or the unity of all things, by emphasizing being right and they're being wrong, or by you being alive and they're deserving to die. And actually, if they die, you die, because we're all in it together. And this is a great place to end, I think. It's the coronavirus Torah. If they die, you die. Because, which is the teaching of the tough, because it's actually true. Even if people you don't like die, they could infect you. And so if they die, you die. That's a horrible teaching. I hope everyone lives. But the point is that everyone has to live. And so I think this is part of what God is saying. This is just my take in the rejection of emet, of truth, and tough with death, saying you're also death. And by the way, even though you were supposed to live because you're righteous and that's why you were marked, it actually becomes the mark of your death because you didn't save them. That's the ethical teaching about truth. And the Zohar's emphasis at wanting to get people together and not drive them apart. Okay. We'll move more quickly through the letters.
I know you're wrapping up, but I just the logic here doesn't seem to make sense just based on the plain meaning of the text. And then I won't dwell, but you know, the reason Tav doesn't get it is because you're destined to be marked on the foreheads of the faithful, and by your mark they will die. But the point was everybody died. They didn't die because they had that mark. It turned out that mark failed to save them. But I wouldn't say by that mark you will die. If anything, they still were distinguished as the people who followed the Torah from Aleph to Tav. So the mark is still doing a good thing, even though it wasn't enough to save the people, is how I would read it. So I don't quite understand. I mean, the last part, that you're also the seal of death. Okay, that I get as a counter argument to Tav's argument. But I don't see the first part as a counter argument. And if you're ready to stop, we can just stop there.
No. So the response to that, and this will be, I think, the last, we'll open up for a question, and this will be the last note, is that the tough, I think what that means is the following: by your mark they will die, is like, actually those people didn't also die. They actually deserved to live. The only reason they died was because they were marked with the tough, meaning there's actually something endemic to the way in which they were righteous. And this is what the Zohar is saying. So actually your question hits at the teaching. It doesn't say it in full because it's relying a little bit, I think, on knowledge of the Talmud. And maybe we should look at the inside of the Talmudic text next time. But the way in which you were righteous is the reason you died. Like the nature of your righteousness is why I killed you. It's not like it wasn't enough to save you, but it would have been. You're actually dying because you were righteous. They're dying because they weren't, but you're dying because you were. But they weren't. In other words, because you had the mark righteous, you die. So it actually is a great devaluing of the mark righteous. It's like evil dies and righteous. Well, the first Psalm says that the righteous people live like a tree beside the water, and the evil people die. But the Zohar says, no, the evil people die because they're evil, and the righteous people die because they're righteous. Because we're all in it together. And there are no evil people and righteous people.
I mean, maybe because they're self-righteous.
So maybe the Zohar says righteous can often equal, or very easily equal, self-righteous. And that's always a good reminder to all of us who, I think because of normal human biases, want to think of ourselves as righteous. I would acknowledge, right? We all want to think of ourselves as good people. Like if you'd ask yourself, am I a good person? Maybe you'd recount your flaws in ways other people don't know. but primarily you'd still think about yourself as a decent human being. So the Zohar is just noting that that can easily move to a place of self-righteousness, which is in
quick informational question. Who marked their foreheads? Did they mark it themselves? Like, oh, I'm righteous, because then that fits Marvin's point perfectly. Because, you know, who the hell marks their own forehead with the letter of righteousness, right? That takes a certain special something.
We should look at the prophetic passage there. I don't know if anyone. Oh, well, okay.
Footnote 83. I think he has it there.
What? In 83?
Footnote 83.
He talks about this whole thing. Right. It's all still the passive, those marked. But who marks it? Like those who are marked? Well, who marks them?
No, it does say, put a mark on the foreheads of those who moan and groan over the abominations. There's a kind of negative mood to that remark, right? Like these righteous people, they may be righteous, but they're moaning and groaning over the abominations instead of doing anything about it, right?
Yeah, right. This is also a good reminder to end on one of my favorite notes, which is that I think rebuke is out these days, but I am a fan of rebuke increasingly. Why? It's a mitzvah in the Torah to rebuke. It's one of the big ones, but also, and there's something perceived as pushy about rebuking other people. It says, you should surely rebuke your neighbor. And then it ends by saying, and then you won't hate your neighbor, it's not in your heart. There's a way in which not rebuking someone, not in a judgmental way, but in a like, you care about them way, and they could disagree and being respectful of their opinion, not in like I'm right and you're wrong, but in like I think you're doing something wrong, legitimately, is an act of care. And actually, if you don't rebuke people that treat you wrong, you may come to hate them. You may just hold up the anger inside. And there's this sense in which there's an overly individualistic perspective in having a fear of confrontation that doesn't allow for the difficult but important, difficult dialogues of conflict that the Torah is trying to get us out of, and saying, engage, even if it's a tough conversation, or tell why you feel like they wronged you. It's pushing us in that direction. In the mystical context, that's because of a collective metaphysical unity, right? Which is to say that like we're out of accord if we're not in good relationship with someone, and we need to fix that. So that's just a mystical spin on that mitzvah. And with that, we'll end this. Maybe that's a justification for Mera Lorza in his call to socially shame those that don't wear masks. Critiqued. But I just want to go on record in this Zohar class as saying I think the Zohar supports Mera Lorza in saying, don't wear the tough while your neighbor gets the coronavirus. Save your neighbor too. Even if your neighbor is one of those like anti-science protesters on the State House steps. And with that, we end this shir. I wish everyone a great week. And again, ask all of your questions about alphabets to Joe, who will probably hate me after this class. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
See you on the next.
you.